welcome to another episode of Witty CFB. Your host Rob Sheply here. And on today's episode, we are going to be doing a deep dive into the USC Trojans. You know, as everybody knows, it's their first year in the Big Ten Conference. There is an immense amount of pressure on them considering the shortfalls that Lincoln Riley has had as USC's head coach. You have the expectations of the Big Ten, and you also just have the general standard of what USC football is. Now, I'll be the first one to say I love the traditions of USC. I remember the days of, being young enough to, being old enough to remember seeing Matt Leinart on the field and Reggie Bush and seeing Pete Carroll and all of those guys. So I think there's always all those, memories as a college football fan that I think regardless of whether you're a USC fan or a Penn State fan or whoever can admire and appreciate those moments. But I think over the past, decade or so, there's just been this, longing for them to be back to the relevance and, championship material that, people come to expect. And, Lincoln Riley's going into his third year, replacing Clay Hilton, who's now, ironically, at Georgia Southern, who would have thought. But there's just so much unknown with USC that I felt it was a very intriguing topic to talk about. Now, I'm not going to sit here and, talk shit about USC like Paul Feinbaum did, because I think, sometimes, do I think a lot of his criticisms are valid? Yeah, they are, which I'm going to have a couple criticisms about Lincoln Riley and, Lincoln Riley in general too, which I would agree about. But at the same time, I think what's missing about that rant, which by the way I think is worth listening to, is I think he missed a lot on kind of what he has actually accomplished before. Like, for example, he won 4 straight Big 12 championship games. He is pretty much an offensive savant where he's mastered the air raid offense. He studied under Mike Leach. He has so much experience. He was at Oklahoma for 5 years, and I think a lot of the time because he's been a head coach for so long, I think everybody kind of forgets that he's only 40 years old too. So, as long as he wants to go at it, he, probably still has another 20 years to be a coach. But in any event, here and now, the reality is, USC just simply needs to take that step forward. But I'm finding a lot of reasons why I don't think that's going to happen. Now, first things first, there's a couple things that I want to point out about USC in general. When I look at this roster, I see a lot of talent here. I think for the most part, USC has done an excellent job at attacking the transfer portal and being able to plug in immediate needs as necessary. I think a valid criticism that Paul brought up on his show was I know Lincoln said this in an interview with Adam Brentman too, which is obviously that the fundamental purpose of any college football program is through high school recruiting. However, I don't think we've seen that as much as we should for the type of program that USC needs to be. Now, do I think USC has taken strides to get there? Absolutely. But I think at the same time, it's not, I think they kind of need to shift that a little bit more and start attacking the high school recruits a little bit more, as opposed to kind of just relying on a transfer coming in and hoping that it will just kind of balance out from, whoever's leaving for the NFL. And as I think about this too, I know a lot's been talked about, USC going from the Pac-12 to the Big Ten, and I'm not going to harp on that too much. But the one thing that scares me from a USC perspective is, the one thing I admire and love about Big Ten football is it's just so physical. Like when you watch a Michigan and Penn State game, that game's going to be in the trenches. They're going to try to run the ball. And what I'm scared about from a USC perspective is when I think about USC, I'll elaborate on their schedule a little bit, but when they have to go up against the defensive lines of Penn State, Michigan, Maryland, Nebraska, Notre Dame, all the other, Notre Dame's not a part of the Big Ten, but they play them this year. But all those schools who, for the most part, their bread and butter. A lot of those teams are on defense, particularly. I elaborate on Rutgers too. But in any event, I think that's one thing that I'm particularly nervous about when it comes to Rutgers, and also, it's not so much that not so much that USC doesn't have the talent there to make it to the next step. To me, the more fundamental issue is, at least on the offensive side of the ball, and really in terms of the whole team as well, is that there is just a lack of experience all around. And right now the incumbent to take the starting job is redshirt junior Miller Moss, and we've seen a little bit of him here and there, but there is a sense of unprovenness when it comes to the offense at large. And like I said too, I don't want to sit there and doubt Lincoln Riley, because as everybody knows, Lincoln Riley coaches the offensive side of the ball, and he doesn't give a shit about the defense. That's just the way he is. I'll talk about the defense a little bit more in a second, but that's the way Lincoln Riley's always been, is offense, offense, offense. The defense kind of gets blown away on the wayside. But in any event, he is a master at the air raid. He's done it all. He's coached 3 Heisman Trophy candidates. He's done a lot, and he did have a really good start. Moss did have a great start in the Holiday Bowl, and I think there is some genuine promise there. He threw for 372 yards, 6 touchdown passes. So it's not as if they don't have anybody there. It's just when you think about moving forward, it just has to be immediate. Like, he's not gonna be able to be patient like a Dylan Raiola at Nebraska, for example. Like, he's gonna have to immediately come in, and you're not gonna have that grace period where, hey, if you throw an interception here and there in a rough moment, they'll get over it in 3 weeks. It's just not that sort of situation. And outside of Miller Moss, when I think about this offense, I mean, I still think the number one issue is going to be the offensive line. I think one thing in general is sometimes the pass protection was just simply not there on the on USC side. I think a lot of the time the offensive line got bailed out by having athletic quarterbacks such as Caleb Williams being able to move out of the pocket and make those plays that are just spectacular to watch. And I just don't think when you play defenses like Penn State, when you play defenses like Nebraska and Michigan, there's just not as much leadway. Obviously too, like, yes, they've played some great defense over in the Pac-12 too, like Utah, who they've lost to twice in the Pac-12 championship, and also they totally collapsed against Tulane in their bowl game too. So, like, I think there's just a lot of things that are kind of ramping up in terms of Lincoln Riley just having pressure. I think it's just a lot of things that have been just escalating to the point where I think this is just such a it's important, not so much because I don't think he's gonna get fired. I don't think it's that sort of hot seat. I think it's a hot seat more of like, okay, it's your 3rd year, and when you think about the chancellor and the president and the overall fan base, like, if it were me, I would be thinking about it more of, am I seeing enough here against this super brutal schedule? By the way, I would argue probably one of the toughest non-conference schedules in all of college football. I think we just need to kind of evaluate, like, how much are we progressing and how much more can USC become a more all-around football team? Because really the fundamental issue that we've talked about time and time again is that USC doesn't play defense. Now, granted, they are bringing back some starters on the defensive line, particularly in Bear Alexander, who transferred from Georgia, had a really strong year one, and I really think they're going to have to lean on him, especially when it comes to running the ball. I just think they're really gonna need to rely on him, and I think this is one of the most understated things in all of USC talk. But they did bring in Deanton Lynn from UCLA, who was defensive coordinator at UCLA under Chip Kelly, and he took UCLA's defense, and they went from 87th in total defense to 11th in just one season, which, to me is incredible considering the lack of resources that sometimes UCLA has, and also the lack of effort in terms of recruiting on that end too. I just think that's just impeccable, and I just think that needs to be spelled out more. And also it's important that USC also brought in North Dakota State's head coach to be the linebackers coach, and there's so much experience on this coaching staff, and I think it also speaks to Lincoln Riley double downing on, really focusing on the offense side of the ball. And when you have Lynn, you have Mike Erbs, you have Doug Bell, you have all these different coaches who have that sort of pedigree, it just, I think that's one thing that I admire that Lincoln did, was he said to himself, hey, if I know that defense is not my strength, I'm going to double down and bring in people that know what they're doing. And I think regardless of what you think about Matt Entz at North Dakota State, what you think about Doug Bell, what you think about Eric Henderson, who's your new secondary coach, there is a massive transformation that's going on. And, we might not see how it might not reach its peak this season. However, I think there's a lot of overall questions about the overall depth on the defense, the overall talent. Now, granted, there are a couple players that you can build around, particularly, I talked about Bear Alexander. They have a couple linebackers that they're bringing back, which is great. But at the same time, when you play such a brutal schedule, you just can't really afford to have those kind of questions. Now, I think another thing that's just simply, going against them too, is this schedule here. Now, I don't, regardless of, how great your offense is, which, by the way, under Lincoln Riley, they've had, a top 8 scoring defense relatively consistently throughout his tenure at USC, which is great. But when you look at the schedule, you kind of have to ask yourself, to what degree does that offense bail you out against some of these programs? Now, I will say, for example, starting off against LSU, going to Death Valley, which, by the way, that's not on your calendar, it needs to be. But in any event, that's a great start. And I think the one thing that USC does have going for them in that game is LSU did not attack the transfer portal as much as they should have. And also there is a glaring weakness on the defensive line that I think if USC can get going fast enough, I think it could possibly get ugly. Now, do I think that's going to happen? Probably not. But I would probably argue that I think it would be more likely that it gets ugly with USC winning than LSU. But in any event, when you look at the schedule, really the only sort of cupcake games that I would argue, or even, semi-cupcake, after LSU, you have Utah State, which is fine. And, I brought up UCLA, which will be a homecoming game for Lynn. They're going to travel there, so it's not that bad. But, when you look at the rest of the schedule, I think the one thing that's going to be tough for a lot of the, old Pac-12 schools such as Stanford, such as USC, etc., is they're going to have to do just so much traveling. And I just think it will take a toll to some capacity. Those schools may have more talent than whoever they're playing, but there's a lot of outside factors that may go against them. And when I look at this schedule, after Utah State, You go to Michigan, then you play Wisconsin. I would say thank God you're not hearing jump around over at Camp Randall Stadium, which is good for them. But you go to Minnesota. Luckily, you host Penn State, which will also be another great game. Then you go to Maryland. Then you got Rutgers, Washington, Nebraska. I talked about the UCLA game, and then Notre Dame. I think the one thing that USC does have going for them on the schedule, although I would argue this, that middle part of the schedule is definitely a gauntlet. What they do have going for them is their overall travel, games that they have to travel to, is really not that bad, because you have Notre Dame at home, you have Penn State at home. Really, the toughest two games are LSU and Michigan, and those are within the first three games of the season. So I would say if you're USC, I think you either have to. I think beating LSU or Michigan is a must. I think you have to win one of them. I think you can get away with losing one of them, but if you can, I think if you can hold LSU close and maybe pull off an upset versus Michigan, I would. Yes, Michigan's taking a step back, but they're probably still the favorites in that game just simply because that they're home. But they have just many questions too. So overall, my general consensus is, I think USC can sneak into the playoff. Absolutely, I think generally that has to be their goal, because I think they're just don't have enough talent to be able to really kind of fight for the Big Ten title. However, if you can pull off 9-10 win season, and you have a couple of those other teams who, maybe have an upset loss or don't win their conference championship like they can, it's definitely possible that they could make some noise. However, with the overall, pressure on Lincoln Riley, between the, new faces are coming on the offense, the unproven defense, losing twice to Utah in the Pac-12 championship, and also losing to Tulane in the Cotton Bowl like you did. There's just so many questions that have to be answered, and I do think this is such a prove-it year for Lincoln Riley, in the sense of, I just think if something does go south, there's just going to be a hell of a lot more pressure than I'm talking right now. But I think right now, the general focus is we should be giving him the benefit of the doubt. But there's just so many questions between the schedule and the defense and his overall track record that I think as a USC fan, you do have to be a little bit nervous about it.